April 2021, the east end of Big Bend National Park in Texas. We left Del Rio and started our drive at around 9:30 in the morning. 9:30 is fairly late by our standards, but this drive is only about 5.5 hours long. So even though we're getting a late start and we have to make one gas stop, we still expect to be there by about 3 o'clock. As we settled into the drive, Janet relaxed and read one of her books. Janet generally passes all of our trips by either reading a book or surfing the web. But here, internet service is not the greatest, so she spent most of her time reading her books. Once I settled into the drive, I started listening to my audiobook and the travel instructions coming from my Garmin GPS. I tried reading a book one time, but we decided that just wasn't a good idea. As long as the weather is nice, the driving is easy. But bad weather and a narrow road and oncoming traffic, and the ride becomes interesting. The weather during this trip was mostly rainy. That's no big deal. We just slow down a little bit and continue. It was still raining as we finally made it to our halfway point and the gas station where I needed to refuel. I picked my gas stations very carefully. I'm nearly 70 feet long and I can't back up, so I have to make sure that I can get into the gas station and out a different way without the need to back up. I also have to worry about the overhang. I'm nearly 13 feet tall and some of these gas stations just don't have room for me. A little research on Google Maps and a satellite view of the gas station generally tells me everything I need to know before I get there. Although I don't mind driving in the rain, I really hate getting out and filling up in the rain. It's cold and it's wet. Anyway, $140 of diesel later, we're off and on our way for the second half of our trip. The back road out of this gas station was a little rough. You can't see that from Google satellite view. But it was short, and in no time at all, we were back on the main road and making our way to Big Bend National Park. I like driving on Sundays. There's generally less traffic. It makes the driving a whole lot easier. A little more than 4 hours later, we pull in through the entrance at Big Bend National Park. Oh, and if you plan to come down here, make your reservations early because the campgrounds get filled up very quickly. We made ours almost 8 months in advance. Just to give you an idea of just how big this park is. Remember, I said that we were about 4 hours into our trip and our trip is about 5.5 hours long. We still have an hour and a half of driving, all of it, through this huge national park. We're staying at a place called the Rio Grande Village, which is really the only RV park at Big Bend National Park that has full hookups. That means we get water, power, and sewer. All the other campgrounds at Big Bend National Park are primitive campgrounds. That means no sewer, no water, no electricity. You get absolutely nothing but a spot to either set up your tent or park an RV. For those of you that enjoy camping in tents, this is the park for you. There are many tent campgrounds on this park, and some of them are really secluded where you may be the only one within miles. Oh, and did I forget to mention, there's a lot of black bears in this park, so enjoy sleeping in a tent. As for us, we're now pulling into the Rio Grande Village, and we're going to start setting up our bear-proof RV with power, sewer, and water. Since we still had some daylight left after setting up the RV, we decided to take a hike. Our first hike was to the top of that hill. We wanted to start off with something easy, and this hike was only about 4.5 miles long. This was an easy trail. It had stairs to make it easy to get up the side of these hills, and in areas where the stairs weren't there, it was still fairly easy to walk up the trail. After driving all day, we wanted to do something easy. We weren't quite ready to do anything really hard, so this was a good start for us. It's been a long time since Janet and I did any kind of hikes that included trying to climb up to the top of very high hills and mountains. And although it was a bit of a wake-up call, the view from the top was its own reward. We were a little tired, and our legs were a little sore, but we were happy to be standing up there and looking around at the view. This hill sits in a little peninsula of land. The river you see there is the Rio Grande, and it flows on 3 sides of this hill. Most of what you see up here is Mexico, although some of those mountains up in the distance are actually north of the Rio Grande and therefore in the United States. We're actually planning to hike some of those mountains and are looking forward to it. As you hike these trails, you'll find these little areas where you can pick up a souvenir. Mexicans from the nearby village come out every morning to lay these things out. You can take what you want and just leave the money behind. It's all in an honor system. As for us, it's time to get down off of this hill with a quick stop at the Rio Grande River before making our way back to the RV for the night. We're done with hiking for today. On the second day at Big Bend, Janet and I headed off to do our first long hike. The trail we selected for our first long hike is the Ore Terminal Trail. This trail is an 8-mile round trip, and it's listed as a difficult trail. I'll tell you right now, we did not hike the full 8 miles. We made a bit of a mistake in starting out early afternoon, and it was just really hot. The trail started off pretty easy. There was nothing really difficult about it. There was a couple of hills, but they were all small, and the trail was pretty much flat, so I didn't see where this thing was difficult, or at least not yet. But we do have to cross that mountain dead ahead of us, and that is a ways up. We're about a half hour into our hike, and the temperature is starting to get close to 90 degrees. It is really warming up. This trail is called the Old Ore Trail because it follows a tramway that used to carry ore from Mexico up across these mountains. The tramway carried 90 ore buckets and was 6 miles long. Between 1909 and 1919, when this tramway was active, it carried zinc, lead, and silver. It carried it at a rate of about a half a ton per hour. And as we followed this trail along what used to be the old tramway path, our hiking trail got more and more difficult as we went further and further into the mountains. The temperature now was starting to get up at around 95 degrees, and there wasn't even the slightest hint of a breeze. Keep in mind, this is still April, and 95 is about as hot as it gets. In August, it's 110. At about 2.5 miles in, we took a good look at where this trail goes and how much farther we needed to go, and it was time to make a decision. Well, it didn't take us too long to decide, and we decided it was time to go back down the mountain and back to our car. It's not that we were all that tired, but we were really, really hot. And although we did have plenty of water, we just didn't know how much hotter it was going to get. So we decided best to go back and plan better for tomorrow. The way back was mostly downhill, which is a good thing, because by this point I think we were a little overheated and we had to stop a few times to cool down. We made it, and we'll plan better tomorrow. Yesterday wore us out just a little bit, so we decided to take it easy today. So we decided to start out our third day at Big Bend by going to the Fossil Discovery Museum on the park itself. This was an outdoor museum and had a sampling of fossils, All of these fossils were discovered on the park itself and in this general area. The fossils go back nearly 100 million years, and there's a lot of pictures that show what this area looked like back in the day. After spending some time looking at fossils, we moved on to our next stop. After all that walking yesterday, we decided to make the day more of a driving day with just a little bit of walking thrown in for good measure. We're heading out there. We decided to drive Dagger Flat Rd. The road is 7.5 miles long and ends up in a canyon far up ahead of us. The road itself isn't all that bad. I mean, it's bumpy, it's got some good-sized rocks that you have to avoid, but it's not so bad in the SUV. As long as you take it slow and easy, you really shouldn't have a problem driving this road. As you drive further and further down this road and closer to the canyon, the scenery outside starts to change. One of the first things you start to notice is that the vegetation outside starts to change from a brown to a green. The road ends in a forest of giant dagger yuccas. This is the only place in the park where you can find a forest of these things. The tops of these plants have a mostly white flower. This flower can weigh up to 70 pounds, and some of these plants are almost 30 feet tall. I'll be honest, this is not what I was expecting when I heard that the road ends in a forest. But this is a desert, so call it what you want. I'll just say that it was really pretty and I enjoyed walking the area and looking around. And after spending some time hiking the hills, Janet and I decided it was time to sit down and have lunch. Now you might think that a beach chair in the desert is kind of odd, but don't forget, we went to the Fossil Museum and we know that 100 million years ago, this was a sea and this area was in fact a beach. So technically, we're sitting on a beach. After enjoying a leisurely lunch and just sitting outside and enjoying the sunshine, it was time to make our way back down that road. The drive back was a lot easier, mainly because I had a better feel for the road and I knew what was coming up. The interesting thing was that we saw no cars on the way out, but on the way back, we actually had a traffic jam. We passed 3 whole cars going into the canyon while we were trying to make our way back out. The road itself had some mild little hills that you had to watch out for, along with some washes that you had to be careful going back through. But it didn't take long until we were back at the pavement and finally back at the RV, and that ended our 3rd day at the park. I think tomorrow we'll take a day off and just relax at the RV. Day 4 at the park started with a beautiful sunrise. But after 3 packed days, we decided to take the day off today and just relax and smell the flowers. Although I chilled at the RV all day, Janet went out, took a walk, and got some great pics along the way. This is a picture looking across the Rio Grande and into Mexico. The locals that live across the river in Mexico cross this river every day and drop off handmade artwork to be sold to the tourists in the Big Bend area. They often cross the river with their burros and carry all of the artwork that they drop off strategically all over the park. You can find these displays on almost every hiking path near the river. Janet had some good timing in being able to actually capture a picture of one of these entrepreneurs. But for the most part, our 4th day at Big Bend was more of a rest and relax day. We needed to gather just a little bit of strength for our next big hike. After getting some rest yesterday, we're all ready today to start hiking these mountains again. But we learned our lesson that first day, and it's not even 9 o'clock in the morning now as we pull into this little parking area alongside the road. Today, we plan to be back here at the car no later than 2, preferably by 1, as the temperature is forecast to be up in the 90s again. Earlier this week, we did a little bit more than half of the Ore Terminal Trail. Today, we're going to do either the 14-mile Vega Trail or the 14-mile Strawhouse Trail. Although I don't know which one of these trails we'll do, I do know that we're not going to do 14 miles. We'll do someplace between 5 and 7. We'll take them slow and easy so Janet has time to stop and smell the flowers. Our first landmark is right about there. We need to hang a right and go through that pass. And although it looks like a pass, we're still going to have to climb a respectable distance up in order to get through it. Near the top of this little piece of trail, Janet and I had to pull over to let some hikers that were a bit faster than us get by. These guys started in the same parking lot we did, and they were only a few minutes behind us. They're doing the Vega Trail, and they intend to do the whole thing. So right here, they're 2 miles in of a 15-mile hike. Since I put together the videos for all of our hikes, I get to hike a portion of every trail with a camera in my hand. Makes for an interesting climb sometimes. We're slowly making our way up this last climb, and slowly but surely we're making our way to the very top so we can go through the pass. This is pretty much normal for all of these mountain trails. You can expect to find rocks and boulders and all sorts of plants with stickies on them that try to make you bleed as you travel through them. But every now and then you get to a spot where you just have to stop, look around a little bit, enjoy the view, and enjoy the idea that you've walked all the way up here just to take a look at what's around you. And yes, a lot of these valleys look the same, but they're not. And we walked all the way up here, so we're going to stop and enjoy the view. After a little bit of a rest, it's time to move on and continue scaling this mountain. You know, from a distance, this looked like a low pass that took us through the mountains. But as we get closer and closer, it's not so much of a pass. We're doing a whole lot of up to get through these mountains. This trail, the trail that we're on right now, is also marked as difficult or strenuous, and that's because of all of these ups. There are some really steep climbs and the camera just doesn't do them justice, and trying to crawl over these rocks, it's not as easy as you might think. It doesn't take much to lose your footing, so you kind of have to pay attention and look out for any loose rocks so that you don't step on them and twist an ankle. Walking out of this place is hard enough. Limping out of this place would really ruin your day. So now I'm up at the top of this pass, looking back to where we started this morning. We started right behind those little mountains at 9 o'clock this morning. And after an hour and a half of walking, we're finally at the pass, and it's time for us to make a decision. From here, we can take the Vega Trail or the Strawhouse Trail. This is the Vega Trail. And this is the Strawhouse Trail. Well, that was easy. Strawhouse Trail it is. The Strawhouse Trail has no more big steep climbs. It still has some minor hills, but no steep climbs, so we opted to take it. For those of you wondering how we don't get lost out here, well, for the most part, you can see the trails, but when you can't, you look for these things. These markers will help you spot and stay on the trail. Well, we're about 2.5 miles in, and we found this rock, and it looked like just a perfect place to sit down in the shade and grab a snack. We've done some hard climbing, and it's getting close to noon, and the temperature is really starting to go up again. So our thought right now is to sit down, drink some water, get some rest, eat a snack, and figure out how it is that we want to get back to the car again. We know that we don't want to go back the same way that we came. After all, we've already been there. But while we were on top of that pass, We did notice a dry river that looked like it was going back the way we wanted to go and would eventually link us up with the old ore trail. So that's what we did. We're going to follow the river back. A short way down the river, we passed by this beautiful cliffside. This is why we take a different way back. If you want to see some new and beautiful sights, you have to get off the beaten path. And that's in Big Bend or anywhere. You have to go out and explore, because you never know what you're going to find until you go out there and look for it. The walk down this river started off pretty easy, but as we got closer and closer to the pass, it started to get a little bit more difficult. The river narrowed as it got closer to the canyon, and you started seeing a whole lot more rocks and even bigger boulders. From here, we started to be very careful about where we planted our feet. As you look at this, you should know that these drops are a lot bigger than they look on the video. At this point, we're starting to get into the canyon proper. An upside to this is that it's shady. The temperature must have dropped 10 degrees, and 90 is no fun while hiking. In here, it's a nice, comfy 80. This canyon is starting to get very narrow and deep. The rangers tell us that if it rains, we need to stay out of these canyons because they're very prone to flash floods. We haven't had rain in a long time, so we can enjoy the canyon and the view. Finding the best way down is not always as easy as it may look. There are quite a few times where you have to stop and it's like, this drop is way too high. So we need to look around and figure out if there's a better way to get down there. We've hiked canyons like this before, and we've come to a point where you just couldn't figure out a way down and we simply had to turn around and go back the way we came. Fortunately, this time we found a better way down, because if we had to turn around and go back, it would have added about another 2 miles to what is already becoming a fairly long hike. So after we found our way through, we continued our way down through the canyon and hopefully make it out the other side. Big boulders always make for an interesting walk. You can't just drop down these things. They're 3 to 5 feet high and the ground underneath is seldom flat. But when you find a way down and you make it through, you feel really good about yourself. You passed up and conquered an obstacle. Another very important thing to remember is that you have to be able to get back up the drop that you came down, because what you don't know is if there is another obstacle in front of you that you won't be able to get past. So it would really suck to find out that there is a drop in front of you that you can't get through, but you can't turn around because you came down a drop that you can't make it back up on. The odds of a ranger finding you before a hungry bear are slim and none. My money is on the bear. But for us, that obstacle back there was the hardest obstacle going down this canyon. From that point on, although there were a few other places that were a little dicey, none were as difficult as the one we passed back there. So we were able to make it through the rest of this canyon without any issues. But eventually we came to the end of this canyon, and unfortunately, the end of walking in the shade. It was now time to get back out there into that sun and back out into that 90-degree temperature. From here, it was an easy half-hour walk in the sun to get back to our car and end our hike for the day. And so it's time to get back to the RV, get a little food, get a little rest, and get ready for tomorrow. It's day 6 of our stay on the east end of Big Bend National Park. Today we intend to spend all day off-roading down the East River Road. Although our final destination is the Mariscal Mine, there are some stops along the way that we intend to make. East River Road is labeled as an unimproved road, and the park recommends that only 4-wheel drive vehicles with an extra high clearance should take this road. And although it started off nice, it didn't take long at all before we found out why they recommend this. The road in places gets narrow and rocky with some fairly good-sized ruts that you have to maneuver. But after about 20 minutes of driving, we made it to our first stop. This area is called the Crusher because it used to have a large rock crusher out here that was used to build the roads in this area. But we came out here for the scenic view of the Rio Grande and the surrounding mountains. You know, I bought this Jeep because it has an air suspension that lets me lift it up 18 inches, and boy, it really came in handy going down these roads. But after spending some time enjoying the view of the Rio Grande, it was time to continue down East River Road. The road was constantly changing. It was easy driving across the flats, but then you'd encounter a steep climb or a steep drop. Our next stop was a little pullover we found while traversing through one of the canyons. This area had some nice rock formations that we wanted to get a better look at, and some small hills that we wanted to climb so we could see what was around us. The guidebook that we bought told us that if we explored the desert in this area, we might be able to find some calcite crystals. So we started looking around. I couldn't find any at all, but Janet seems to have an eye for these things, and she was spotting them all over the place. Janet spent most of her time exploring the flats while I climbed to the top of the hills. It was from the top of one of these hills that I spotted a foundation of what used to be an old rock house. Hard to believe that somebody used to live out here. The only thing I can say is, why? I mean, it's hot. It's unpleasant. Yes, during the springs, there are some pretty flowers on the cactuses you can look at, but still, it's hot, it's unpleasant. So although I don't know why those people came out here all those years ago, I do know that Janet and I came out here for the photo opportunity. But again, it was time to move on. After all, we're still trying to get to the Mariscal Mine, and it's still a good 8 miles or so ahead of us. And on these roads, 8 miles equals about an hour because you can't do much more than 8 to 12 miles an hour. Oh yeah, this used to be a mercury mine, and most of the areas and the buildings around here are toxic, so they really don't recommend that you touch anything. Look what we found. Out here in the dry desert, things tend to last. Can't believe someone drove this thing out here. I mean, there's areas out here where modern Jeeps have issues. How did this thing get out here? Well, anyway, as we looked up to the side of this one hill, we spotted the Mariscal Mine. I took this picture as we got closer, because a mile and a half down in the valley from where we first saw this thing, you could barely see it because it blends into the hillside so well. You know, these hikes remind me of the walks I used to take as a boy going to school. It was uphill, both ways, in the snow. The only difference here is that it's uphill, both ways, in 95-degree heat. But now, just like then, all you needed to do is keep on going uphill and eventually you would get there. You know, I expected to find a mine. What we really found was a mining complex that was a lot bigger than anything I expected. Mercury was discovered here back in the 1900s, and after that, a mining claim and development started fairly quickly. Most of the workers that worked this mine came from Mexico and lived in a little area down in the valley. This mine stayed active and producing mercury from 1900 to 1927 when it finally closed. Although it did reopen in 1942 to 1943, but it quickly closed and stayed closed after that. We found several different mine shafts in the area, all of them of course boarded up so that you couldn't go in there. And although you might not get this from the pictures, these mines are small. You can't walk upright in these things. You're stooped over and there's only enough room for maybe 2 people to go side by side. There was nothing easy about the work these people did, and I'm sure that mercury poisoning probably got most of them in the end. So, after a little bit more exploring and checking out some more of the buildings in the area without actually touching anything, it was time for Janet and I to hit the road and make our way back. We made some random stops along the road on the way back to the RV, once just to stop and take a look at some beautiful flowers that we saw, and one time to admire these horses that we think are wild horses just roaming the desert. But what we were actually looking for was an old abandoned road that would take us out to Rooney's place. I'm really surprised we spotted it because it's really hard to see. Rooney's place is just an old rock house that's located down this road about a half a mile right along the Rio Grande. As the name implies, this place and the land around it belonged to a guy named Rooney who lived out here and farmed the land. How he farmed this land, I haven't a clue, and the book doesn't tell us. And again, my only question is why? Was there nowhere else this guy could go and start a farm? Well, anyway, as for us, it's time for us to go back to the car and make our way home. It's been a long day. We've been out here a little over 7 hours driving and hiking through the desert, and frankly, we're tired. So, back to the RV we go for some dinner and some rest. Good day today. And so, our week here on the east end of Big Bend National Park is finally over, and it's time to start thinking about packing up the RV and moving on. This past week here was absolutely packed and just flew by. After spending this last year doing pretty much nothing because of COVID, it felt really good to have something to do and someplace to go nearly every day. While here, we did hikes, we scaled mountains, and we visited museums. And it was nice hiking through the desert and making it to the top of the mountains. We also took the time to take some drives out in the desert and see places that you just couldn't get to unless you had a good four-wheel drive vehicle. Our trusty Jeep worked just as hard as we did when we were out there, but together we saw some beautiful sights. And although we enjoyed some of the strenuous hiking and the relaxing by an ancient seashore, it's still time to move on. And so we're leaving the east end of Big Bend. And of course, we haven't added any new states to our list. It'll be a while before we leave Texas. So that's it for the east end, and I guess we'll see you at our next stop.